Hi, I'm here for my White House tour.
Okay. Are you staying at the new Trump Hotel down the street at the old post office?
No.
Too bad. If you stay there 2 nights or more, you get a bonus tour where we show you the dungeons where we keep Ted Cruz and Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Oh, I cannot afford that hotel. I'm doing an Airbnb.
Is that still even legal? I know it was at a meeting where they said we were going to make Airbnb illegal. It's organized crime or something. People should stay in hotels with recognizable names.
Can we start the tour? Like, what is that room over there? Is that a cabinet meeting?
That's the Roosevelt Room, but we sublet it to the Trump Organization. Those people are hearing about timeshare opportunities in the new Trump China properties.
Who made that noise?
I did. We all know how to make it. It's kind of a throat-singing thing. Do you want to stop at the gift shop?
Didn't we already pass the gift shop?
We have 8 of them in the White House now. This is the one Tiffany actually runs. Hi, Tiffany. Don't look so sad.
Can I just stop you right there? This is the White House, one of the most potent symbols of American democracy, and you people have made it a den of thieves and money changers. It's really unbelievable the way you turned this into just another Trump profit center.
I know, right? It wasn't easy. But once you lock up 3 or 4 law professors, the rest fall into line.
I have to sit down.
That's one of the Trump chairs we sell made by Kurdish involuntary workers in Turkey. They're on sale today. Let's walk down to the map room and I'll hook you up with a salesperson.
I have to admit, it's really comfy. Well, I'm deciding. Here's a show on the problem of Trump's business interests. Also, a Fidel Castro story you haven't heard before and a moral response to acts of hate. And now he just found out emoluments were not a kind of mint. Colin McEnroe.
Yeah, I thought they were like Tic Tacs, which I know that Donald Trump also likes. So I figured maybe he was just switching over to emoluments. All right, we're going to talk about 3 different things today, as the introduction just suggested. A little bit later in the show, and this maybe is the one that I felt most powerfully over the weekend. Look, we can debate about all kinds of things that are either right or wrong or in some kind of gray area, and we're going to during the run-up to the Trump presidency, talk about things like what we're going to talk about right in just a couple of seconds now, whether or not there are objectionable conflicts of interest between Trump's private business interests and the job of the president. We talk about those things, lots of other things. There's some things about which there is no debate, and one of those is the rise of hate speech. I think the Southern Poverty Law Center has recorded something like 700 instances since the election of hate speech. And I mean, these things where letters get sent to mosques saying that President Trump is going to help us cleanse America of you people, that kind of stuff. That stuff, it's just a non-starter, and we really do have to find some way to object about it. I'm not shy about saying that this country is going to need to have an organized response because it's happening at a quick rate. People feel very emboldened suddenly, the worst kinds of people. So we'll be talking about that with a theologian. And then lastly, we're going to tell you a story about Fidel Castro that is different from other stories that you may have heard over the weekend. Maybe I won't say anything more than that. I'll just I'll keep you in suspense, as President Trump would say, President-elect Trump, that is. All right, so we're going to begin with a conversation with Drew Harwell, who reports on business for the Washington Post. But before we bring him aboard, just to kind of introduce you to this issue, which I'm sure you've been hearing about over the weekend, here's a little montage.
If I become president, I couldn't care less about my company. I have Ivanka and Eric and Don sitting there. Run the company, kids. Have a good time.
So you'll put your assets in a blind trust?
I would put it in a blind trust. Well, I don't know if it's a blind trust if Ivanka, Don, and Eric run it, but is that a blind trust? I don't know.
I'm very confident he's not breaking any laws. He has many lawyers, accountants, and advisors who tell him what he must do and what he can't do.
All right. Well, there are things that you can do that maybe you shouldn't do. And probably if you're going to base some of your decisions on a blind trust, you should know what one is. However, there's so much more to say about this, and Drew Harwell is joining us right now. As I say, Drew reports on business for the Washington Post. This is the kind of business that has occupied his attentions quite a bit recently. So welcome to our conversation.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So just to get a sense of the kind of octopoden nature of the Trump organization, in a way that, I mean, it was reported on during the campaign, and it was part of some of his public utterances during the campaign. But there were so many issues going on during the campaign. I'm not sure how much it sunk in with any of us, just how big and sprawling his worldwide empire is. Sometimes, of course, his empire consists of simply licensing his name someplace. But still, he's involved in, 18 to 20 countries at least?
Yeah, that's right, at the very least. And that also includes, the U.S., where he has lots of different interests from coast to coast. And, yeah, it's one of those things where it's kind of the problem that was so big that we all didn't really see it during the campaign. And we did some stories about it, the New York Times did some stories about it, but it was always sort of, kind of pie in the sky, a potential problem for down the road. Now, these conflicts of interest are real things that are going to be dealt with over the next 4 years in a very, potentially risky way. But he has, more than 100 companies he's working with in all of these countries. All of those have different goals, and sometimes those goals are sort of counter to what the president would want. So it's a big issue.
It's not. Some of these goals are not only counter to what the president, meaning any president, would probably want, but some of them even seem counter to the rhetoric with which we associate Donald Trump. I mean, for example, he, during the campaign, portrayed Muslims and Muslim regimes as problematic, borderline, dangerous. Most of his rhetoric about Muslims was incredibly negative. On the other hand, you look at what's going on with him in Turkey, and it seems as though he has a much more simpatico relationship with a sometimes repressive Turkish regime than you would expect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. I mean, and Trump's name is on buildings in Indonesia, which has more Muslims than any country in the world. His name is in lights over Istanbul in Turkey that has plenty of sort of political strife to go around, and lots of sort of sensitive diplomatic financial ties with the U.S. as well. So, I mean, these would be problems if Trump was just a business person trying to do sort of corporate profit making in all these countries. They're especially problematic for not just him, but the rest of us when he's also, at the highest office in America, sort of making these decisions and sort of filtering down the culture of how these diplomats and other, U.S. officials should be dealing with these countries in ways that may be opposed to what his business interests would rather.
So let's take Turkey just for an example, because the other part of this, obviously, I mean, he's not sworn in as president yet, so the rules are a little bit different. But one of the questions you have is, all right, so you've got these business interests, you've got this political leadership role in the United States. To what degree are they in conflict, and to what degree can you benefit from, let's say, altering your political stance about something? So during the campaign, some of Trump's rhetoric did inflame the Erdogan regime in Turkey. They had some negative stuff to say about his licensing deal there. And it did appear, I mean, we don't really know, but it did appear as though he altered his rhetoric about them and got something out of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that company as well that owns the building, Trump Towers in Istanbul, also has sort of changed their rhetoric in the aftermath of the failed coup this summer and these increasing government crackdowns where, they're a huge media company and they're increasingly sort of parroting some lines that the Erdogan regime and the Turkish government at large would like to sort of push forward. So when you see that love connection there between Trump making lots of money off this building and a company that's growing closer to the Turkish government, whether by force or by desire, you start to question, how strong are these ties? Is Mr. Trump or his kids or his cabinet going to make decisions that potentially save that very lucrative revenue stream? Are they going to back away from potential measures that could sever the ties between the U.S. and Turkish government, or at least make it not as fun to deal with? This is the gray area we inhabit. We haven't really had a president who has had this many conflicts, so all we're sort of left is with questions, and the real criticism is that Mr. Trump isn't really giving us any reason to not ask these questions.
Right. In other words, if he drew some hard, fast, bright lines and said, I won't step over them, you and I probably wouldn't be having quite this conversation. We might not be having any conversation at all. But let's take another example from your reporting. So Deutsche Bank is Trump's biggest lender. He's a very highly leveraged business individual, but that's the number one lender to him. And so this isn't theoretical or speculative at all. Deutsche Bank is involved with the U.S. Justice Department right now. Do you want to explain that?
Sure. Basically, Deutsche Bank, huge European financial institution, but they also lent a lot of loans to the U.S. housing market during the housing crisis. A lot of these were toxic loans. And so they're one of the many banks that has sort of been investigated for these abuses, and they're currently sort of negotiating a big settlement with the Department of Justice that could potentially be as much as a $14 billion fine for the bank. So that's, a potentially bank-busting penalty that the bank would rather not deal with. So they're currently negotiating that now. It could be $14 billion. It could be $4 billion down the road when the settlement is finally agreed upon. But, on the same token, it's Trump's biggest lender. He has an incentive to keep them loaning to him or his kids or his company because they're one of the few Wall Street banks that has still lent to the Trump company after a number of bankruptcies. So there's a potential, craving for simpatico between Trump and Deutsche Bank. And meanwhile, of course, as President Trump will, appoint people to the Department of Justice, people who could potentially steer that investigation and a certain way that Trump may desire. So here you go. I mean, this is Trump's finances and his, responsibility to be an independent arbiter, to put in people who will, sort of do the right thing for the Department of Justice. Those two are colliding here almost more than anywhere. And this is a case that's still ongoing. We really don't know when the settlement will be reached. And even if Trump doesn't tilt the scale and the settlement comes out, less than the $14 billion we've heard, the perception there is going to be, well, what if, did Trump get involved in this process? The perception is almost as bad sometimes as the conflicts, the real effects, because it undermines sort of trust. It undermines our ability to believe that, Trump was doing the right thing for the country.
Now, in the middle of his transition, one of the things that has briefly interrupted it was a meeting with business partners or business associates from India. India is a place where Donald Trump is also doing business. So tell us about the Trump Tower Mumbai.
Yeah, Trump Tower Mumbai, and there's another project in Pune, India. India's, I think, the biggest, country that Trump has interest in outside of the U.S. There's obviously a growing middle class there. There's a large luxury contingent in cities like Mumbai. So, there are business partners that the Trump company have worked with to sort of put the Trump name in lights above some of these projects like the Mumbai project. And meanwhile, during this transition period, Trump has also met with some of the folks who were involved in that project and who have, reasons to do business with Mr. Trump and who are now seeing, a grand potential success in having fomented that relationship even before he was the president-elect. So, he's had the folks who are working on that company up to his Trump Tower penthouse in the days after the election. There's clearly been a strong relationship there. Even one of them was seen with Eric Trump, Trump's son, at the election night sort of celebration. So clearly there's a relationship there, and it's a relationship that you wouldn't necessarily see from an independent kind of third-party vetted politician who may be, tasked to make these kinds of independent decisions.
I'm talking to Drew Harwell for the Washington Post right now. I want to ask you also just about reporting this story. One thing we still don't have, obviously, are those pesky tax returns that we couldn't get during the campaign. In terms, and they may contain things involving countries that neither you nor anybody else who's reported on this so far knows about. There may be little surprises waiting in there. But in terms of assembling the picture that you and other journalists have assembled, are you just sort of running around looking for different pieces of the jigsaw puzzle? Is there any central place where, as a matter of disclosure, all this stuff has accumulated?
Yeah, a lot of it is running around because you're right. The tax returns are not there, and there are an incredible, amount of detail in those returns that we just can't see, including foreign accounts, including if he has money in Russia, yada yada. But we've sort of cobbled together some stuff from the personal financial disclosures that most politicians are expected to file during their campaign. So in those you see the scale of the more than 500 sort of company business interests that Trump is involved with. You can kind of make the connections. Here, this one is in Mumbai, this one is in Istanbul. You can start to map out the scale of them, but there's still so much we don't know, and there's still so much that Mr. Trump could make public and still hasn't. So it's been a lot of making calls with people in other countries, some of our correspondents who can help us do some field work, but there's still such a cloud of sort of mystery over the real size of his empire and how many of these conflicts there are out there.
So I think a lot of people looking at a situation like this would think, all right, so he was a businessman. He had what he had. He had these existing projects. Some of them were moving through a pipeline while he was running for president. Nothing he could really do about that. Just got to let it play out and figure out what to do about that later. But based on your reporting, Drew Harwell, that's not strictly the case. In other words, there are things that have been put in motion while he's been running for president. And I think in your reporting, Saudi Arabia kind of jumps out as an instance of that. Tell us what you've learned about what's been going on between Trump and Saudi Arabian business interests.
Yeah, the Saudi case is another sort of reflection of the many questions we still sort of have. But while Trump was on the campaign trail at a rally in Alabama, sort of making these things, that same day there were 4 to 8 companies. 4 are still active, but 8 were made in total, sort of based in Jeddah, which is the second biggest city in Saudi Arabia, has a ton of money. It's an oil-rich kingdom, and so the names are very similar to sort of other hotel projects that Trump has had in cities like Mumbai, and here it is attached to this kingdom in the Middle East that has a lot of sensitive sort of diplomatic ties with the U.S. and that is a country that even Mr. Trump himself has sort of falsely claimed was one of the main investors of the 9/11 attacks, and who attacked Hillary Clinton many times for accepting money from the kingdom, and yet here we have this potential business interest. But who he's partnered with on that, what he wants to do, any money that he's gotten from that, Trump won't say, and no public filings sort of reveal. So, we're still sort of looking for what exactly he's seeking to do in these places that the U.S. has really important interests. But we know that in some of these countries, permits have moved ahead in the transition period on projects that has the Trump name attached. Were those potentially pushed through by state officials who wanted to keep the interest tight and strong with the president-elect? These are the questions we're sort of dealing with in Saudi Arabia and at home, too.
Yeah, and in your reporting, one of the things that you pointed out was on the same day that he registered 4 companies to conceivably do business in Saudi Arabia, he gave a speech to a rally in Alabama where he said, Saudi Arabia, I get along with all of them. They buy apartments from me. They spend $40 million, $50 million. Am I supposed to dislike them? I like them very much. So, in a way, one of the difficulties of trying to expose anything about Donald Trump is that he's usually exposed it, well before you even thought of getting interested in it, and talks about it with no shame whatsoever. So this puts us into the grayer area that probably is less a matter of the fine reporting that you've done so far, Drew Harwell, and trying to figure out exactly how this is all going to proceed. I mean, probably a lot of it is going to be in Congress's lap. We all know Mr. Trump has said there's no such thing as a conflict of interest for the president of the United States. I mean, many legal scholars have weighed in to say, well, I mean, there may be ways in which a president is permitted to do certain things that would be prohibited for other people. That doesn't mean it's not a conflict of interest or that it's not a problem. There are laws. There's laws against bribery, for example, which would apply to the president of the United States. But I would assume this is all kind of terra incognita, looking forward into the mist. I mean, we don't really know or have any indication, except maybe from individual people, like maybe somebody like Senator Elizabeth Warren, like what's going to happen next. Do you have any idea, like how this is going to get thrashed out?
It really depends on how much force the the folks in Congress want to take with this kind of thing. We've seen the Democrat side of it, and the Democrats are clearly going to make hay of this, and potentially for good reason, and sort of pointing out these conflicts of interest. This is going to be a target that's going to be on Trump's back for as long as these are issues. So how much will the GOP tolerate? Obviously, they're in power in the House and the Senate, but they have reasons to sort of question these things too, and they're not necessarily part of the Trump organization umbrella that would benefit from some of these business conflicts, and they have the potential to be endangered by some of these things because they don't want to look like they're in conflict with the Saudi Arabian government doing things that are against the American people. So Mr. Trump has sort of been right in that there are conflict of interest laws that sort of affect the most government officials, including elected officials, that don't affect the presidency, that don't say he has to put his assets into a blind trust. But there's a tradition of these sorts of things that lots of presidents in the past have sort of followed, and for good reason. And, like you said earlier, I mean, there's a difference between something being legal and something being totally 100% proper and ethical. And we've had sort of advisors on ethics and the law on both party sides saying, the things that Mr. Trump and his family are doing right now, are concerning and could be concerning for the entire, term of his presidency. So, anybody can sue a business, so I think we'll be suing lawsuits on that side. But it's also sort of curious, what will Congress do? Will Republicans continue to sort of tolerate these sorts of things, or will they speak out?
Couple of quick last questions. There have not been anything other than the most crude and fumbling explications from Donald Trump about how he kind of understands, any kind of firewall that might exist. And the one which we heard in the little montage at the beginning was this notion that, well, if he lets his kids handle all this stuff, is that a firewall? First of all, it's not really something that he should be asking as a question. He should probably know the answer to that. But, I think one of the things that would be worrisome about that as an explanation is that Ivanka Trump has been part of at least 3 conversations that he's had with foreign leaders, and he's named to the New York Times Jared Kushner as somebody who might be, maybe his point man on Middle East peace. That doesn't suggest that they are going to live in this very separate realm as far apart from the government as possible.
No, it doesn't, and it sort of suggests that Mr. Trump doesn't see or finds it's not really important to sort of create that firewall because he said his kids will be really important parts of his company. He said they will sort of lead it, manage the day-to-day, and yet Ivanka has said on meetings with the Prime Minister of Japan and with other countries, his kids still have relationships with investors and government officials in other countries. And meanwhile, they're on, the executive committee of his transition team, sort of helping him figure out some of the most important positions in the Trump White House. And it's clear why these are issues. These are issues because his business and his politics and his policy are totally one and the same right now, and there's no division at all. But we can maybe give him time. We can maybe expect that lawyers will tell him to strengthen this firewall as we get closer to January 20th. But right now, we're just not seeing any sort of encouraging signs that these are going to be separate. And if anything, they're going to be maybe closer than ever.
All right, last quick question. We said the tax returns aren't out. One of the reasons he gives for the tax returns never making their appearance is that he's being audited by the IRS. Well, he's about to appoint the top leadership of the IRS. Similarly, as you've pointed out, he has a case with the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, which is looking at one of his Vegas business interests. He will be appointing people to the NLRB. I would imagine, once again, a lot of it depends on how much Congress gets its back up about this stuff, but this is an unaccustomed level of conflict.
Yeah, we've never really had it in a president, and when we've had sort of presidents in the past who have been very rich or had many business interests, they've almost always given them into a blind trust or sold them or made some division. Here we have Trump literally tapping the people who will be appraising his property for potential legal penalties. In D.C., he's just opened this luxury hotel where he's both the landlord and the tenant, so you can imagine how fun that would be to be the federal official sort of renegotiating rent with the president. All these cases where we're just at a totally new, unprecedented quagmire here of seeing the president be on both sides in an incredible position to sort of improve his business interests, success, while being in the Oval Office. So there's lots of questions. It's going to be an interesting 4 years.
Well, Drew Harwell, thanks for being on today. You guys are doing great reporting. I want to say that even though I'm a fellow journalist, I spent $99 this weekend on a digital subscription to the Washington Post.
Yes.
So go tell Jeff.
Okay, I'll run over there now. Thanks.
Yeah,
thanks
tell him Happy Cyber Monday. He got $99 of my money. All right, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Well, when we come back, we'll be talking about a different kind of question, maybe a more pressingly moral question after this.
I believe in free speech. You don't like the words I'm saying? Bad. There's no such thing as hate speech, man. God bless Donald Trump.
Back to Mexico! If you don't like the country, get the hell out of here! Stop acting like a radical Muslim. Stop acting like a illegal immigrant.
Muslim is not a religion, partner. It's an ideology.
You don't come and talk about America when you're supporting Muslims. Build that wall! Build that wall!
If you don't speak English and don't contribute, get out!
So that's a little bit of how America sounds. Parts of America, hopefully small parts of America, but it's a little bit of how America sounds post-Election Day. There are a lot of people who might have been a little bit more quiet and reticent about their prejudices who are speaking in a very loud voice. I heard over the weekend about an incident in West Hartford in which a young Latino-American woman from a family that I know was harassed in a similar way. People driving by in a car saying, go back to where you came from, that kind of stuff. Quite often, when this happens, people cite the candidacy of Trump. And we had some very alarming letters written to mosques in California, both in the Bay Area and in Southern California over the weekend, which not only threatened and disparaged Muslims, but also cited the presidency of Trump as an indication that things can be done. So, I'll just take a personal moment before I bring the guest into this, but this stuff really can't stand. We can have long conversations about whether he's got conflicts of business interests and whether or not Steve Bannon is an appropriate person to be a senior counselor in the White House. And I mean, there's a lot of stuff that can get debated out, and there's some things about which we can afford to have a wait and see attitude. But these are not among them. The degree to which at this point Muslims, Mexicans, other Latinos, Jews, and African Americans have all been subjected to maybe a heightened level of invective since Election Day is something which, as a society, we have to repudiate. I kind of would like the president-elect, that is, to repudiate it much more emphatically than he has so far. But we want to talk a little bit more about this and how it connects, I guess, to the world of theology. It connects very powerfully for me. Joining us is Jennifer Kalin, assistant professor of religious studies at Iona College. Thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So, this is, I don't know, I was sitting in church on Sunday thinking about all this stuff and thinking, there's not a huge gray area about what the right thing to do or what the right way is to respond. But as you're teaching this, as you're interacting with young minds about this, what kinds of conversations are you having?
Very difficult ones, frankly, because especially this college age of exploration and oftentimes rebellion against what they're being taught at home. They're very difficult conversations as they wrestle with the questions of ethics, and not just ethics, but what turns into moral behaviors, really. Speaking of being in church on Sunday, we just began the season of Lent as Christians, and that's a season of hope and love and joy and peace. And yet in that season, we are wrestling with these questions of hate speech.
So one of the things that has gone on in campuses, is that notion of safe spaces, safer spaces. It seems to me that, with the kinds of things you heard in the montage, the kinds of things I was talking about in the introduction, the world got less ostensibly safe, although I would argue that the world was never that safe a place, that it's an admirable thing to want college campuses to have safe spaces. But the reality is, that to behave as a moral person and to insist on better treatment of other people always comes with a certain amount of risk. I don't know. What's your take on that?
No, I would agree with that. I appreciate the terminology there of safer spaces, right? Because safe space takes a lot of time and trust and effort to create, and so a space is not inherently safe, unfortunately. But in our ivory towers, as they call them, right, they are spaces where we can at least engage in these kinds of debates and conversations, and generally they are done in a manner that is productive. But to have that type of confrontation, even in these safe spaces, is risky, right? Because it reveals something about both of the individuals, which is one of the things that I try to move past, especially with young people. These issues are not necessarily about individuals, right? I've heard this often in theological circles that hurting people hurt people, right? And so to get beyond kind of the hate speech and what people are saying and get to what the issue or the problem really is for that individual is a difficult step to take, but it's a necessary step to take to move beyond kind of this place of hurt and anger into a place of peacemaking and solution finding.
And a lot of that involves looking beyond our individual circumstances to kind of build on the point that you're making. I've been reading this weekend this guy Shane Claiborne, is kind of a radical theologian, and he wrote that the love that he saw expressed in America after 9/11, quote, simply reflected the borders and allegiances of the world. We got farther and farther from Jesus' vision, which extends beyond our rational love and the boundaries we have established. And he's talking about the fact that, he could see people loving the families of 9/11 victims, loving soldiers who fell in battle later, but not understanding how to love, say, Iraqi people who died as a result of our military actions, and who, from a theological perspective, an Iraqi civilian deserves every bit as much love as a U.S. soldier or somebody who died in the World Trade Center attack. But that's still an incredible challenge, I think, maybe just for human beings, but also for Americans. We're not used to, because of our notion of exceptionalism, we're not used to thinking past, the boundaries of our own skin.
Sure. But it's always kind of been in our social movements to move towards this kind of ethical community of love, right? So Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. espoused this beloved community, but he did so knowing that it would mean we would have to change our souls, right? We would have to change the soul of this country and the lives that we live. But as a result of nonviolent action, one could create this type of beloved community. And that is still possible, right? In the wake of our president-elect and kind of the movement of the alt-right and the hate speech that has come about as a result of this election, which is not new. It's just publicly more public at this point. It can awaken a counter-movement, if you will, can awaken this beloved community that was very much a part of the rhetoric of the civil rights movement in the 1960s.
Yeah, although, first of all, I'm completely in agreement with everything that you say, except that, when I'm on social media, which is a very bad place to explore any kind of serious notion, but it's the place a lot of notions get explored. When I put forth that idea that Martin Luther King and Gandhi and Jesus are part of a tradition of saying, that you do have to love the people who are the most difficult people for you to love. You almost have to look at these incredibly difficult people as gifts from God, as a chance for you to expand the limits of your soul. So people who are really, really pissing you off right now are, in fact, the people that you should feel most empowered and obligated almost to love. people who are really down with the whole idea of the Reverend Martin Luther King, they've not absorbed that message. You try to tell them about that, and they go, "Oh, well, no, I'm not going to do that. Those people are jerks," or they usually use a much worse word than that. It's a hard, at least I think it's very, very hard for most people to absorb the kind of thing you're talking about right now.
Absolutely. I mean, it certainly has been hard for me to kind of get to this place and to be reminded to hold on to the hope of developing this type of vision. But in the meantime, I think it's also important to acknowledge kind of where we are, right? And so Judith Butler, a philosopher, in her essay, Excitable Speech, writes about what hate speech does to us and how it wounds us. But she also talks about how it creates a space, right, for us to change kind of the atmosphere, to kind of change that hate language and use it for a different purpose. And so for the people who can't quite get to I love my enemy at this point, I think it's okay to do something. And sometimes that something is as simple as, what we're now calling hashtag activism. And I kind of view that as a form of education. If you want to repost a story to educate people on issues of racism or white privilege or issues of sexism, and I think that's also an important way for people to move past kind of the paralysis that hatred can cause and move towards doing something, which a lot of times can lead us to being able to open up a dialogue. And again, I think it's also about not individuals, because that's what's most hurtful when we think of it as someone shouted this explicative to my friend or to my neighbor. But when we get behind that, kind of what Buddhist practice teaches us to do, kind of putting that positive energy of love out there, we can see that, again, that hurt might be coming from a completely different place. One, that education can open the door to a productive conversation, perhaps.
This has been so great to talk to you. And speaking of starting a dialogue, I hope you come back. Lots of other things I want to talk to you about. Jennifer Kalin, Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at Iona College. Thanks for being with me today.
Thank you.
All right. We're going to take a break. We're going to come back. We're going to have a very special guest in studio, one of your favorites, to tell you a story about Fidel Castro. A story I can guarantee you is unlike the other stories you heard this weekend.
I know it's Cyber Monday, but I resent the Russian hacking of my Amazon account. Today's show was produced by Betsy Kaplan and me, Kyone Wolf. Executive producer Katie Tolarski appeared in the intro, and our interns are Krusty and Musty Fisher. The part of Bill Curry was played by Zeppo Castro. Follow everything we do on the Colin McEnroe Show page on Facebook. On tomorrow's show, a fresh look at the A word. The real A word, not something else that begins with A. And now, back to Colin.
Yes, we are going to do that show tomorrow. We're going to do a show about that very bad word, the A word, and about the people to whom it is frequently applied, which certainly does not include my in-studio guest right now. You just heard about him. He's our beloved Bill Curry. You've read his work in Salon. Now read it in The Daily Beast. But the reason
Bill... nicest thing you've ever said about me.
Well, it was,
I mean, in decades.
Right.
But, yeah, thank you. It's quite lovely. It's a nice moment.
So the reason that you're here is because any number of years ago, you had an interaction with Fidel Castro, and not a fleeting interaction with Fidel Castro, but one that went on, 11 and a half hours, right? What year was this?
This was in 1989, the year before I ran for comptroller. And I went to Havana. I was there for about a week. And we had a meeting set up with him, and it began at 9 o'clock at night. He's kind of a night owl / insomniac. Mm-hmm. And it started at 9, and it went on till about 8 in the morning.
So, and it went on till 8 in the morning, partly because you and he were engaged in some kind of borderline argument.
There were these moments, but it was. I learned so much in the course of that week there, especially the visit with him. But one, I did sort of go back and forth with him. I debated most things he said, at least rebutted, and you could tell the price you pay for living in a dictatorship. That around the room were all of his staff people, and they just looked so anxious, whether on my behalf or their own. But you could just tell that no one did that with him. And, of course, nobody, no matter how smart you are, you can't stay smart without people, challenging your ideas. But anyway, about midway through it, though, we took a break, and everybody had that real sweet coffee they make down there. Mm-hmm. And he brought me into his private office, and the two of us went into his private office, and he showed me. First of all, he didn't show me. I saw, first of all, on his desk, on yellow notepad paper, all of the reports from the sugar harvests, field by field. Mm-hmm. This was the opposite of the grand delegating style. This was a guy who took the reports in the field, and the main thing being that the people in the field would get the accountability. He then took me into another room to show me a large we'd been talking about housing, and I, at that time, had done a couple of subdivisions in a condominium complex, and so he brought me in to show me this development he wanted to build that he was hoping if the embargo ever got lifted, he wanted to build this huge tourist attraction. It looked like Legos there, but it looked very nice. And then because of that, it sort of the conversation swung into this thing about housing. And around dawn, he says, "Let's go for a ride." And so,
which could have meant to a prison camp.
That's right. That's right. It could have been because of my earlier challenging
prior remarks. Yeah.
And we went out and we looked at a construction site where the micro brigades, they were called, these volunteers from across the country came to work on helping to build this housing. And that was something I'll just say that you couldn't have faked it. I've been, I worked in the White House, I did my own campaigns. I've been worked in campaigns all over the country and the world, and the warmth, the way people poured out to him and touched him, and how comfortable they felt, and how he spoke to them. That would be almost impossible to fake.
Yeah, which was not everybody, we should say, too. I mean,
No. I saw lots of things there that I liked, but I was never for a moment unaware of the fact that because I am genetically wired for dissent, if I lived there, I'd be living in prison.
Right.
And so that's the other piece.
Or you could have tried to float over to Florida or something.
I could have floated to Florida, or I could have escaped because I'm that kind of guy. That kind of Conde Monte Cristo thing. I think I've really got that going.
But I want to make sure we do justice to this dawn caravan that you went on. So this is like him in a car with like one or two guys.
He's got a driver and a security guy.
Were you leaving Havana? Did you go?
No, we were in Havana. No, we never left Havana. I barely left it the whole time I was there, in fact. But and it was 3 or 4 miles, from his office, yeah. And we got there, and again, they also couldn't have faked the shock on the workers' faces.
Yeah.
It's like 6:30 in the morning, and who shows up but the president? And it was an extraordinary thing. I still have a couple of photographs of it.
It was like that the one time El Grasso visited the press room.
Yeah.
We were shocked. We didn't know what to do. We didn't know what to say. So not that there's any other basis for comparison. So one thing that you wound up concluding that I've never heard anybody else say, and some of this I think is a result of your subsequent visit to El Salvador where you were talking to, was it Ruben Zamora that you were talking to?
Ruben Zamora, yes.
The opposition leader.
So the Democratic Convergence Party.
So you and Ruben Zamora concluded that you and the two of you plus Fidel Castro had something in common. What was that?
A couple of months later, and I would just like to interject, my friend Lindsay Madison, who's since retired, but who was an extraordinary activist, the most interesting person in Washington, never heard of, and it was because of Lindsay that I got to end up being with Castro and being in a war zone in El Salvador and polling in Nicaragua and being in West Berlin the week the wall came down and working with Willy Brandt and all these other opportunities that never would have come to me ever otherwise.
You're kind of Zelig.
And that's right. It was it's like a Forrest Gump thing. I'm in all those pictures and because I ran a lot.
I gave you Zelig and you insisted on Forrest Gump. Let's let the record show that.
Yeah. And so a couple of months after I'm in Havana, I'm with Ruben. And what I'd noticed in the meeting, apart from Castro's brilliance, was he's really one of the smartest people I ever sat in a room with. And was that he constantly referenced not political science, certainly not Marxism, but the New Testament, and that he was as conversant in Scripture as any politician, as genuinely conversant as any politician I'd ever met. And he not only he enjoyed throwing it back at people like me who were criticizing. I criticized the wages of his workers, and he came back about materialism and how it's instead of making the sort of Marxist materialist argument, he talked about the empty souls of workers in a consumer society and quoted a great deal of Scripture to support it. So a month later, I'm sitting with Ruben Zamora in the courtyard out back of his house, next to his house where his brother had been assassinated, and we were right in the courtyards right next to each other, and we began talking, and And it turned out that Ruben had dinner with Castro at around the same time, a month or so before I had. And so we both began comparing notes. And what we both realized was that the three of us had something in common, which is that we'd all been educated by Jesuits. Mm-hmm. And Castro, he didn't matriculate at Florida, but he visited. But he was in Jesuit preparatory school and college in Cuba. So his entire education was the bulk of his education, was with Jesuits. And he was clearly paying more attention than he understood, and it showed not only in his forensic skills and the debating part of it, but I began to see the degree to which his view of the world was rooted in values he acquired there. He misapplied many of them, but it was in a part of the. And I just say one thing about Cuba itself and the society they created. And again, I wouldn't be enjoying any of these fruits because I'd be in jail. But I thought of it during the Elian Gonzalez thing shortly thereafter, and I thought if they said where would he be happier? And of course, with his natural family is the first answer. But this impoverished island nation has a higher literacy rate than the United States. Has universal child care, has universal health care, not the high-end stuff. You'd want to come here for that, but for the day-to-day health care. It has lower crime rates. I grew up in Northern Hartford. I know what it feels like to be in a city where people feel safe and where they don't. Drug rates. If he was going to be a lower middle-class or working-class kid for the first 20 years of his life, he was going to be better off there. If his parents were making $125K or more, they'd be better off here. And if he ever had a political thought in his head, of course, he'd be better off here. Mm-hmm. But what they had accomplished there was simply irrefutable on examination. And while I was there, I could go wherever I wanted. I had a couple of days where I was completely just myself and one other person with me and a guide, and he was instructed and he went whenever I asked, and I purposely mixed it up. And I visited child care centers and doctors' offices and went throughout the city, and it was quite striking.
I want to go over three things really quickly. He took you out to this this site where he wanted to put this development. He didn't try to sell you a timeshare or anything like that, right?
Well, I have one. I haven't been able to get back down.
You're always kind of a sucker for things like that. And back to the Jesuit thing. So this is really kind of interesting. And this is the way Castro talked about it. He said that he studied as a young person, as a kid, at a place called Belén, I think. He said it was very dogmatic. And he described himself as having been a restless student. But he also said the Jesuits, quote, influenced me with their strict organization, their discipline, and their values. They influenced my sense of justice. So that tends to back up,
It was the overwhelming impression. So I got to meet him once. But I was with him for 11 hours, and for 10 of it we talked about politics. And so a couple of those impressions I really felt quite confident of. And that was the main thing, that to hear him speak and defend his socialist government for 11 hours. He did it almost entirely with reference to Judeo-Christian values, replete with scriptural references. And part of it was just a kind of toying with us to throw our own values back of it. But part of it was clearly, every so often you felt it in his voice, that this was something he believed. Mm-hmm. This was something he believed.
Well, also, as you and I have both said many times, you kind of have to twist Jesus around like a pipe cleaner to get him to support capitalism. You have to sort of really do an awful lot of work.
No question. The entire New Testament is stories of inclusion. It's prostitutes, Roman soldiers, tax collectors, lepers. Everyone's forgiven. Everyone's included. And a good quarter of the stories are about servants who got paid as much as the ones who came earlier, and about people having to give up their fortunes, and about all worldly things coming to rot, and working on the soul and loving one another unconditionally. That's the message. And so clearly what Ruben and I concluded in that courtyard a couple months later was that he'd been paying very close attention. This is the first I've ever heard a quote. This is the first quote I've ever heard from him acknowledging that.
But it is, it's one of the ironies of life that it's, for Fidel Castro even, not cool to be a Christian communist, and it is cool to be a Christian capitalist, and that doesn't really make any sense in terms of actually what gets said there. But anyway, very quickly, last question. We don't have time to talk about the Arthur Wood story, which is a family story of yours. I have a screenplay in development right now anyway. I don't want to. But very quickly.
Am I getting a piece of that?
You didn't happen to run into Victor Herrera down there, though, right? That's the other. You and Victor Herrera are the two people who probably have spent the most, and maybe Arthur Woods from Connecticut has spent the most time.
This is the point at which I'd like to mention that it was a State Department sanctioned trip that I was on with a couple of people who'd been ambassadors under Carter. going, and we were exploring some of the ways in which we might move toward a relaxation of tensions. But the other thing about Castro that was clear to me was that he didn't want to. He wanted to end the embargo, but he didn't want to end it then because he realized how disruptive it would be to his own power.
All right, we have to stop there. But Victor Herrera, by the way, was one of the people involved in the famous Wells Fargo robbery.
As opposed to me, I was not involved in the famous Wells Fargo.
Well, nothing's ever been
just
proven.
Victor, yeah.
Nothing's ever been proven.
Yeah.
But I've never seen
the name tripped off Colin's tongue.
Oh, you know, I'm looking for Victor 860-275-7266. Call me, man.
Castro is the leader of Cuba. Fidel Castro say no. Batista, tell me why you surrender. Fidel Castro say no. Castro is a real warmonger. Fidel Castro say no.
I get that Castro's legacy will be complicated, but I think we can all agree that he could have been a lot worse for the world. He could have used a private email server.